All right, red light on.
Welcome to Drink Beer, Think Beer, the podcast that gets to the bottom of every pint. I'm John Holl, and this is the second episode recorded live before an audience at Funkfest, the great event put on by Embrace the Funk and Yazoo Brewing in Nashville, Tennessee. In just a moment, I'm going to be joined by the Tomme Arthur of the Lost Abbey for a conversation about the evolution of sours and funky, of tradition and exploration. But first, please go visit allaboutbeer.com. There, you can find original articles, reviews, news, insights, and podcasts. Listen to shows like Brewer to Brewer and the All About Beer podcast simply by searching All About Beer wherever you listen to shows. You can also follow All About Beer on Instagram, Threads, X, and Facebook at All About Beer. And you can keep up with all of the smoked beer news and releases by going to This Week in Rauk Beer. You can search the group on Facebook or follow at TW Rauk Beer on X, Threads, and Instagram. Glassware and apparel is available too on allaboutbeer.com/merch. This show and all of the work we do, it's supported by you. Please go visit patreon.com/allaboutbeer. A few bucks goes a long way to fund writers, photographers, creators, and editors. And there's also a pro level tier for professional breweries and industry businesses out there. If you'd like to learn more about advertising on All About Beer on any of our shows, you can email me at info@allaboutbeer.com. So as I've said before, and I'll say again now, Funkfest has become one of the great beer gatherings in the country. Each year, Brandon Jones of Embrace the Funk and Linus Holl of Yazoo Brewing put together a thoughtful event filled with good cheer, great bottles, wonderful food, and fellowship. All About Beer is proud to be a media partner on the event, and this conversation was the second held during the fest. So here's my introduction of Tomme Arthur, and then the conversation, recorded right from Funkfest 24.
And sitting next to me right now, this man actually needs no introduction, but he took the time to write one anyway. Tomme Arthur is the co-founder and chief operating owner of the Lost Abbey, located in Vista, California. He's been in charge of the successes and failures of the company since its inception in 2006. Lost Abbey Brewing has been turning water into beer since the same year. Prior to that, he was a brewpub brewer for almost a decade. With 28 years of brewing under his belt, he's seen more than a little. His experience with oak aging and sour beer dates back to before Y2K, and he continues to passionately share with any and all who will give him an ear, of which you all here at Funkfest today will do. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Tomme Arthur.
It's a pretty good read, John.
Thank you. Despite the Abraxas, I'm doing my very best.
John's in an elevated state of refreshment, so this is going to be fun. I'm working on it, by the way.
When you talk about your experience of oak aging and sour beer back before the turn of this millennia, and back before you started brewing, or maybe it was when you were brewing, was there a beer in that genre, in that style, that spoke to you and said, this is the path I want to walk?
So the heavens opened up one day. I had my very first Rodenbach sometime around 1996.
Okay.
That was part of my beer journey. I was working at a small brew pub. I'd never had a sour beer. I'd never experienced any Belgian lambics and things. And I just remember the first Rodenbach that I ever had, the epiphany of, wow, this is the complexity, the layers, the depth, the flavors, just the totality of the experience. That really set me on my path.
So when you started brewing then, having had that, were you trying to replicate it? Were you trying to match it? Were you trying to strive towards it? Like, what was, like take us back in time to like young Tomme Arthur.
So young,
you're still young, but
I'm moderately young. Young Tomme Arthur got a hold of a dissertation that was written about Rodenbach.
Okay.
And so I was able to read a 200-page tome on the exact production methods and how they would go about mixed culture fermentations and all kinds of things. And at the point where I kind of really digested most of that information, then I was able to kind of determine the best pathway forward. I was at a brew pub at that time,
Yeah.
and I was able to sort of put together a thought process as to how we might tackle something like that, given that we didn't have lots of volumes of space and things. So the initial batch of beer that was produced that was sort of in the Rodenbach mindset was Cuvée de Tomme.
Yeah.
And that was a stronger version of Rodenbach. And the crazy part of the story goes, we were making it at a brew pub in Solana Beach, and we were actually oak aging the barrels out behind the brewery in what amounts to be a little shed. But the salt air and the nice coastal temperatures were great for the aging of beer in oak, and we released the first batch of Cuvée, I think, in 1999.
In that era, I mean, you put your name on this beer.
Yeah.
It takes chutzpah. Like, that's not...
It's not non-egotistical. Yeah.
I've known you for long enough where I can...
You could ask it, yeah.
Yeah.
It's, to this day, it's one of my favorite things that my friend Vinny and I talk about, because he's never made Vindication. And so I've always... He's often said, you know, it's awfully egotistical of you to put your name
I also
on
like that you're
on a
just
bottle.
dropping Vinny Chilurzo and like, oh, let me help you. You drop that name.
was
Let me
here
help you
last
pick
year.
that. I know.
Okay.
Yeah, he's sat on this table with us. Yeah.
But he was part of that. A lot of the formidable years of oak aging, we were doing things and talking back and forth, and we were both collaborating on ideas and such. So yeah, anytime we can talk about Cuvée, and anytime we can talk about the lack of vindication being made, I'm gonna drop that.
So back then, when that beer came out, and you're thinking about Rodenbach, and the American audience is engaged in a way that I don't quite feel, by and large, like they are today, right? We're looking out over these tents right now at Funkfest. The people who are here, the people who are assembled to listen to you drop knowledge right now is impressive.
That's because we're pouring expensive beer.
Yeah. We're going to talk about this beer in just a second. But I'm really curious as to the evolution of what were people looking for? What were consumers looking for? What were brewers looking to make in that age? And how does that square with where we are today?
I think a big part of it for me was when we were making Cuvée and a few of the other things that we kind of started with. You could actually walk into liquor stores and you could find Rodenbach and Cantillon and Drie and others on the shelf. So when we started looking at making sour beer, for me personally, I wasn't necessarily looking to recreate things that you'd find on the shelf. In fact, New Belgium had just launched La Folie. And
Sure.
so their version of their Rodenbach style beer, which was far more true to type, really played into Peter Brukart coming from Rodenbach and then creating an oak cellar in a forest. And a lot of the beers that I was starting to want to deal with came from my vision of things that were alternative to that, but emblematic. So Cuvée was a dark brown sour ale with cherries in it. It had a lot of flavors of Rodenbach. Michael Jackson once opined that it was Rodenbach on steroids, but it was classic adjacent for me. It was really like, hey, here's what we can do that's in the space, but isn't trying to be purely homage or purely the same.
And that spoke to the American brewer spirit at the time, right?
Absolutely.
Like nobody wanted to rest on nobody wanted to make a Budweiser, like, oh, this is our Budweiser. Like, nobody wanted to do that at
Certainly
the time.
not me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, it's in the early 2000s there was sour beer that was being produced, but it was very small batch stuff. Nobody had really giant farms other than New Belgium with their stuff, but it was obvious at the time that as we all started progressing into sour beer realms, that some really cool beers were going to come out of that.
So where did your creativity, like so Rodenbach sort of set the stage for you, and then I remember at the time sort of writing about how American brewers were fearless. Like, you weren't bound by tradition, you weren't bound by ingredients. It was the age of fuckery.
Yep.
It was the age of, well, don't tell me that I can't do that because I just did, kind of thing. So many of your beers, I think for the crowds and for the younger brewers who are out here, were it helped form their identity as a brewer, and you came from the Rodenbach age, kind of thing. how were you approaching the creation of those early beers?
I think it's important to note that we started dabbling in sour beer in the early 2000s, but it wasn't until we got really established at the big brewery in San Marcos in the late 2000s where we had enough oak and enough opportunity and a sour production side and the right equipment to really take some leaps. And so some of the early stuff was just kind of broad strokes, trying to figure out how it played together, what the connective tissue was. And then when we got to the bigger facility and we had 100 oak barrels, and then we went to 400 or 500 and then to 1,000, we were finally able to understand, what the house culture looked like, how it behaved, and then we could really align that vision with how we could take chances.
So what is the Lost Abbey house culture? How do you...
So it's important to note that we definitely have a house culture that typically runs through Red Poppy and our Cuvée, and historically has also run through our Framboise de Amorosa. Those are all brown-based sour beers, but if you're talking about classic Lost Abbey sours, you're really talking about the blonde sour, and that house culture manifests itself with a lot of stone fruit and a lot of white grape.
Okay.
And so I think when you drink things like Cable Car and Duck Duck that are non-fruited, you really get a sense of how that culture behaves.
So when you started to realize that it was white grape and all of these other things, do you start to then tailor the beers around that?
I think we tailor the premise around what the beer is. So today we're pouring Peach Afternoon, obviously peaches and stone fruit and things.
Yeah.
The Duck Duck Goose is a blend of 1-, 2-, and 3-year-old beers. They all taste different at the house level according to the timing of the beer. So 1-year-old peach culture, stone fruit cultures don't taste the same. Maybe it's more white grapey in a certain barrel. So we blend to those. But for us, the great expression of the house culture comes in the non-fruited beers because you really start to see the nuance.
All right, I want to take a pause for a moment because everybody, I think, has the beer that we're drinking here. So this is Cable Car.
This is 2018 Cable Car.
Tell us about it.
Back in 2007, the Toronado, which is the world-famous beer bar in San Francisco, was celebrating their 20th anniversary. They had gotten a bunch of breweries to all put together collaborative beers or anniversary-based beers. We were a little bit late to the notification, and so we were an unofficial beer that year. No one knew we actually had put this together, and we kind of did it under the radar and showed up to the event and just kind of said, happy anniversary, here's your blonde sour, and it was made every year after that for, I don't know, almost 15 years, I think.
Okay.
To celebrate their anniversary.
Sure, but what is it?
What is it?
A blonde sour, like that's all nice,
Yeah.
but like without the time machine right now.
It basically ended up becoming a blonde sour beer that we would release every year that was from our favorite barrels in that given year. So we would go and say, okay, we need to make 50 or 100 cases, and the volume of that is XYZ gallons of liquid, and we would then go find, or we would have held barrels back from other tastings.
Okay.
So Cable Car became, for us, a beer that was highly rooted in some of the best blonde sour beer from the previous year. It wasn't a blend of 1, 2, and 3s. It was typically 12 to 18 months, and they were ostensibly honey barrels.
How do you pick those? I mean, this is, I love this sort of like intangible. I was talking about this with Phil Wymore on the last panel of just, it's like trying to grab smoke sometimes, and it's only known to you in charge, right? And then we all trust you because at the end of the day, this tastes really great.
Yeah. So, yeah,
But favorite barrels,
it's important to note that a favorite barrel might not be a favorite barrel a year from now.
Okay.
It's just time and place.
Okay.
And it's like, hey, we need to make Cable Car, or we've been sampling barrels throughout the year, and we go, wow, that one's in a really great place. Let's hold that for that project. And then some stuff would be just right then and there, 2 months before we needed to send the beer out, we would go sample 30 or 60 barrels, needing 8 or 10 of them, and maybe we only had 2 that were left behind that were already in the back of our heads.
Yeah.
But the goal was always the same. Go find the ones that express the house culture the best, and we'll work from that.
Are there years that are better than others?
Yeah,
over
for sure.
time?
For sure. If you can line them up and taste them, absolutely. We haven't really gone back and said, oh my God, why was that year better than that? You got to remember, some years we were filling new oak. Sometimes it would have an oak basis to it. This one's quite peppery. It's got a little bit of a Brett kick to it. Also shows a little bit of the oxidation. You're talking about a 2018 release that at a minimum the beer is 6 years old,
right?
But even older because it had to age for some level of time. But it's been in the bottle for almost 6 years.
Right. So when you're like, okay, we're going to do this in front of a panel and we're going to pour the 18, there was a conscious thought behind.
Not today, no.
No?
This was not intentional. This is what we could get to. Yeah. I was telling.
All right.
I was telling someone earlier. We found a pallet of
Sorry,
beer.
nerds. Yeah.
I mean, it's the first time I've tasted it in 6 weeks or so. Yeah, we tasted it before we sent it out the door, clearly. But
okay.
We found a pallet of beer that was hidden in the move. So it was fun to find things like this.
All right. So you just teased the move.
Yeah.
You've gone from. You've been in a couple of places over the course of.
Well,
the career.
The Abbey's
more
only
or
been in
less.
one place.
Right.
Yeah. I personally have been in a couple different breweries,
right.
But the Abbey itself had only been in one facility.
How has it changed since leaving the original?
Or
has it?
It has. Last May we moved out of our original brewing space in San Marcos, and we had been there for 16 years. And in that time, we had developed lots of infrastructure to have an oak side, a sour side, and a regular clean brewing side. At the time that we moved out, we had a non-sour bottling line, a sour bottling line, a sour canning line, and a non-sour canning line.
It's a lot.
Yeah, but that was our commitment to doing it right. Nowadays, we're in a much smaller space. We left 40,000 square feet behind. We moved into a 10,000 square foot building, and it took an enormous amount of effort, but almost all of the packaging lines went away, and we went back to an old school sort of filling sense of things. So today we're running a non-sour canning line and a non-sour bottling line that's basically a gravity fed.
Okay.
So really trying to get back to how can we get back to growing our sour beer program back.
All right, so you mentioned doing it right. And there's something about a sour beer program that requires knowledge, it requires time, it requires...
Dollar bills, yo.
Dollar bills,
yeah.
Sure. There's a lot of breweries that open up today or that have been around for a year or two that have a sour program. And sour is not what it was, wild, funky, whatever we're going to call it. Sour for this moment is not what it was 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. But what does doing it right mean for you? And this is not a slight, but as the elder statesman now of sour beer production in the U.S., what do you want the younger brewers to know? I mean, some are in this tent right now.
Yeah.
You know, some are out in the world listening to this right now. You've been doing it. You've been in the trenches. What does doing it right mean? What does that entail?
My simple answer would be if I'm doing sour beer right, I'm not having to apologize because we made a mistake. And for two, I can get off the airplane in Brussels and walk to Cantillon with a bottle of my beer, and they will receive me because I'm doing it right by them. And what that means is that I'm making beer that's got acid in it,
yeah,
that they think is part of the acid world, right? That this is worthy of being called a sour beer.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff that's being made today that they really don't appreciate because it's cutting into their heritage.
Cutting in how?
Cutting into the sales of their beer and just cutting into their ability. That being said, sour beer is not a given and it's not a right. These big breweries or historical breweries have gone through many ebbs and flows, and they've come close to closing and going out of business because of economics. And we're in a spot right now on some sort of a boomerang rebound where it's not popular and it's not hip. But when we come out of it, I want the legacy of our brewery to have weathered that storm and to be said we didn't change our basis to meet the market. We just waited for the market to come back to us.
But the level of
Somebody dropped their
it's
glass.
a broken glass.
Yeah, it's fine.
It's been a while since I've heard that.
I want to see your O face, John. I got that on your podcast. That's really good.
Well, I have the ultimate edit button.
There you
but
go.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
but
you
we're
do.
going to leave it in. It's fun.
Yeah.
Acidity for a while, though, was almost like
Space race.
the space race, the IBU wars, the ABV wars that everybody went through. But acidity should not have been played with in that manner. And I think that one of the lasting legacies of your beer, time and time again, like wherever I am in the country that I'm drinking it, is I know that it's going to be balanced. And I don't know how to quantify what balanced is, but I trust you as a brewer, and I don't always trust other breweries not to strip the enamel off of my teeth.
For sure.
So where does responsibility and acidity, where does that come into play?
All right, so let's go back to the the heavy acid days, because we're guilty. If I was to pull beers out from the early 2000s, they would have a level of acidity and then that you're not going to find in our beer today.
Okay.
But imagine being a restaurateur and opening up a restaurant and calling it salt and being like, our restaurant uses more salt than anybody else. If you're looking for salt, you come see us.
Right.
Well, you're probably not going to keep your customers because at some point they're going to get tired of licking salt. And acid, the wrong acid's a lot like that. You can have too much of it. So we learned kind of mid-journey that being confident about being lower in acid was going to make for better beer.
Thank you.
And I think that's where, when you start to talk about having confidence in us as a producer,
Yeah.
it comes from the fact that we were confident enough to not push past or to take that out of the finished beer. I want people to be able to pick up a Lost Abbey beer and blindly know that it tastes like a Lost Abbey beer. And that's the balance that you speak of.
Is that hard these days?
Absolutely. Because we're not working with a pure terroir. I can get a bottle of Drefontainen and I get pure mushrooms from the Brett, and there's a Cantillon quality. Our house culture is as close as we have to that, or the perspective of balance, or the sense of intentionality towards the balance is a big part of that. But the terroir is a big part of sour production.
Can we talk about Brettanomyces for a minute?
Sure.
What annoys you about what people think Brettanomyces is?
That Brettanomyces is what makes beer sour.
Okay.
It can make beer acidic, but it's not what causes beer to be sour. I will also tell you that one of the things about Brett that really, truly annoys me is that when I drink beers that have Brettanomyces in them, I dream in 1056. Like, I go to bed and it's like I've been chewing on mushrooms all night, and I have the most fucked up dreams. Like, I'm gonna go home tonight and I'm gonna be like staring at the ceiling because I'm too scared. I'm too scared to turn the lights off. So that
I don't know.
annoys me.
You just hit a chord in the audience. Like, these are your people.
Maybe somebody else feels the same way. I
Yeah.
don't know. I haven't yet met anybody else that has that issue.
But Brettanomyces has become this bastardized kind of like, oh, it's wild, it's funky, it's horse blanket, it's all of these other. You embraced the nuance of it early on, and I feel like that's been lost in the last decade, let's say.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's fair, but like,
It's
fuck it, it's fair.
It's often not used well by American brewers, to be
all right,
fair.
all right. So
So-
how do you use it well? Let's
Get into that?
Yeah, let's peel this onion. Like let's do the let's do the Tomme Arthur masterclass on how to use Brettanomyces well in a beer.
I think it should be pleasing, for one. And I think for two, it shouldn't come off as being super plasticky. It shouldn't be super smoky. And it sure as shit shouldn't be like you just rode in on a horse, right?
Right.
I know that the classic is, I'm a horse blanket. But I think, like, as I said a minute ago, I love the Brett quality of Drefontaine, and I get like dank mushroom or damp mushroom, and it's really earthy, but it's a very pleasing quality. Most of the Brett that's kind of out there, from my experience right now, is just not widely integrated into the beer.
Does that take time? Does that take knowledge? Does that take like how do you
do it?
Yeah, how do you achieve that?
Use less Brett. I mean, we don't use a lot of Brett in our beers anymore. There is some in the beer, but it's it's more natural than not.
All right. If there's homebrewers left, they're taking notes now.
Yeah.
So quantify that for me.
Ah.
Nobody can do what you do. You could throw out a recipe for one of your beers, and nobody can replicate what you do.
Yeah, and I think there's brewers
So you
that do a
should do
better
that,
job
yeah.
of using Brett than we do.
All right.
But they spend more time using Brett than we do. Most of the time, if you're finding Brett in one of our beers, it's come from a barrel and it kind of naturally created itself. I couldn't tell you the last time we bought Brett to pitch into our sour program.
Okay.
So, yeah.
I feel like you're dodging this question, though. So you're not using much of it.
We're not intentionally buying Brett and adding it to the culture.
Okay.
Whatever's in the culture. And a lot of times we'll find a barrel that's really good that has it, and we'll keep making sure that goes forward on a repitching level. But in terms of like, if I was to say I have to put a new mixed culture back into the brewery, I wouldn't know how much Brett to start with currently because we don't have an SOP for that.
Okay.
So I'm not dodging it. I just don't have an answer.
No, I get it. So we're drinking 2018 Cable Car right now.
Yeah.
You must have a library of cellared beers. And I feel like that was a thing for a while of keeping stuff. And Lord knows I've known you for as long as I've known you, and I have a lot of your bottles sitting dusty in my cellar right now that I don't even know what's in there.
Yeah.
But like, and I also don't know when to drink them until somebody comes over and is like, "Oh my God, you have so and so," and it's like, "Sure,
let's
open
drink
it."
that.
Like, let's take it. How has the nature of cellaring changed, especially for a brewery like you, where for a long time it was buy three, and it was drink one now, drink one in a year, and then drink one 5
On
years,
your kid's
10 years?
21st birthday?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like how has that changed?
So when I very first started using oak and souring beers, I'm losing my microphone.
There you go.
Will it stay up though?
Microphone issues.
Microphone issues. There we go. Anytime we made a new beer, I put 2 cases away.
Okay.
So I still have cases of things from 1998 sitting in a cold box.
That's fun.
Yeah, that is fun. Over the years, we get to a point where when we would have a bigger release, we would put a layer away. A layer was 14 cases. Mostly that was just to kind of keep tasting along the way and see how it would behave, and then we could tell the consumer, this was a brand new release, we've never made it, but we think it should go 3 to 5 years based upon heritage or otherwise. My cellar right now is full of things that I'm not sure, like this, when they're supposed to be drank, but they need to get drank.
When was the last time you had one of those 1998 beers?
I was in London, I was in England February for an event with the Weatherspoons pub, and I went to drink some beers with my friend Mark Dorber, and Mark had a bottle
Great writer. Yeah.
He had a bottle of Cuvée that I had given to him in 1998, and he broke it out at dinner the last night we were there, so 2 months ago.
I'm fascinated by this because, so this is my setup. A couple of months ago, I went and saw Billy Joel at the Garden. And I had seen Billy Joel at the Garden 16 years previous, and it was essentially the same show, save for the new song that he had just put out. And he's singing these songs from the 70s, when he wrote them as a younger man going through Christy Brinkley relationship, like whatever it is, like that kind of thing. And I was wondering how 40 years later he feels about those songs, or are they just background noise kind of thing? And it's gotten me thinking a lot about like brewers. So in February, when you're drinking the earliest of your iterations, did you recognize the beer?
It has definitely taken on its own life. So Cuvée from the early days was a very bourbon forward beer. It was used. We would use second or third fill bourbon barrels. It was incredibly cherry forward because it had a lot of cherries. It didn't have a lot of acidity. It did have some different Bretts in it. But the beer that I tasted 2 months ago had an enormous amount of structure. It was still very, very tannic forward from all the bourbon components. It had dried out and had Maderaized in a way that made it very pleasing, but it didn't taste like sour cherry cuvee. It was very much more like a dessert wine, and it still showed enough legs that it could have been left in the cellar, and 10 years from now still would have had enough structure against it, because it had ceased being a pure expression of cuvee, but what it didn't cease being was a great expression of what beer could be.
But as the person who made it, can you remember or identify with the brewer you were at the time that made it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I can identify that I was 4 years into my beer journey. I was taking swings on beers that nobody in my territory or neighborhood was doing.
Yeah.
I was doing a beer that really didn't have a sense of place because nobody had really done that. But what was great 2 months ago was the amount of pride that what we opened wasn't shit, and
Sure.
for two, showed something different than what we had started. But I think evolution is incredible, and that isn't where my brain was when we started. My brain was, I just want it to taste like this today. But when he opened it and I didn't have to apologize, it was a good moment.
Were you worried when they first started pouring it?
It had been a while since I'd opened one. So, yeah.
Since 1998, since, that beer was made, and in the time that breweries have grown in the U.S., beer has grown in the U.S., and we're now in a much different place, right? Where, excuse me, we had those halcyon sour days, and now we're in the hazy days, and now I don't quite know where we're at these days.
Oh, it's lager days, baby.
It's
lager days.
Lager days! Everybody head to the Good Word tent.
Yeah.
How do we as people who have platforms like All About Beer and the Lost Abbey and et cetera, those of us with microphones, how should we be talking about sour these days? Tart, wild, whatever.
Just brought you a lager.
Oh, hi.
I still have. I'm still.
Sure, thank you.
How should we be talking about?
How should we be talking about those these days? Because I feel like sour has always been one of those polarizing words where it's like in those early days of West Coast IPA where everybody was using bitter.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, I don't want bitter, I want sweet. How do we, to the new generation that has come up on hazy, DDH, whatever, or is just drinking really nice lagers, how do we reintroduce sour into the portfolio through education, through words, through flavors?
Yeah, I think that the challenge is that, we've got people who don't have the attention span. If you make
Drinkers.
yes,
Yeah.
if you take and you want to make a real slow fermented sour beer and it takes 18 months to do so, and you've got someone who can kick a sour beer out in 2 weeks' time and can get it to the consumer, give it to me now. We've lost the educational component of low and slow to quick and dirty.
But I also feel like a lot of those like quick turnaround beers are not, maybe 4 years ago, were portfolios and flagships,
Yeah.
and now they're not.
No, I think they're just.
So the beers that are in these tents are the ones that are.
They are far more difficult to make.
Yeah.
And they take more time, but I don't know that the consumer wants to wait right now. And I think that's kind of where we've kind of landed, is that most of what's being consumed that lands in sour beer land is much quicker than slow.
So why keep doing it?
It's a damn good question my finance guy asks me all the time.
Yeah.
Because there's something in heritage. I think that I do believe that there's going to be a set of people who will find the methods of beers that have been very preserved over time and work. And I think that the bigger takeaway is that if you want to have a beer from 2018, it's not going to be a kettle sour in a can. You
Right.
want something that can be put away.
It's certainly not going to be a Citra Mosaic IPA.
Right.
Yeah.
So for us, it's the educational conversation. If you want to put beer in a cellar, and there aren't a lot of people that do today, but you need the right things for it to go the distance. And I have confidence opening a 6-year-old bottle of beer because it was put together the right way.
So put the challenge out to the young brewers, the ones who are in this tent with you, the ones who are listening to this on the rebroadcast. Is it just time and patience? Is it dutiful study? Is it tasting your way and knowing when something's good? What's the assignment for the next generation?
Yeah, I think that it's difficult because we live in a world now where the information exists in a way that never existed before. You can find how to do sour beer from quick sour to long sour and everything in between. Some of the breweries in these tents have committed to having cool ships and things and stuff that really do, tell the story. The challenge is that lots of the younger brewers that have come up don't tell the story the same way. We used to tell the story, we were talking about doing educational forums. So much education is done through digital media these days. So much of it is, what is on my phone. And that's a loss of connection to the consumer if you're really trying to show. And what's happening today is people are getting imbued over a 4x6 table about what makes it different.
Yeah.
And that's a luxury these days. You look sad.
No, there's something about the trial and error, right? And I know that like we put out a lot of information. There's other publications that put out information, and breweries put out their own information, kind of thing. Is there something missing about that blind exploration?
Yeah, I think it's attention span, and I said it earlier. I think the consumer isn't giving the producer the same amount of time that we used to get, so that we could talk about things in earnest, and we could talk about them in a way that allowed us to explain why we love the guy down the street and how we're different because of the way that we choose to do things. The way we choose to be different. We need people to give us what's going on today. We need to be able to stand there and get just enough time to explain to people what makes us different without needing a dissertation.
I like that. How hard is that to get out? We used to. You look defeated when I asked you. You just said I look sad now. Yeah. How the turns have tabled.
I remember standing and doing tastings and pourings and stuff, hoping people would like our beer because it was so radical at that moment in time. It's not radical anymore, and we're doing a great job of having amazing beers, but there's less consumers that are giving us the time for that. So finding those consumers is key, or at least mining for that new consumer.
Well, I'm going to encourage everybody who's here at the fest right now. Tommy's going to go back to his table, I assume, and pour 3 other beers. So go drink Tommy's beers and then everything else. Thanks for doing this.
You're lucky because the Underberg was coming out.
That's right. Tomme Arthur, everybody.
Again, big thanks to Brandon Jones and Linus Holl at Yazoo Brewing for all they've done for beer through this festival and their efforts every day. And you can probably guess we're big fans of festivals with an educational component. If you'd like to talk with us about All About Beer, doing programming at your brewery's festival, please reach out to us. You can do that by emailing me. It's John Holl. That's JOHNHOLL at allaboutbeer.com. That's also the email address to get in touch with questions, comments, or guest suggestions. A reminder, go visit allaboutbeer.com. There you can check out the podcast page, the merch page, read great new content, as well as the archives going back to 1979. All About Beer is on social media at All About Beer. And if you're interested in supporting journalism in the beer space, and we really hope you are, please email us at info@allaboutbeer.com or go to patreon.com/allaboutbeer. Don't forget, All About Beer has a podcast channel now. Search and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. Steal This Beer has new episodes every Monday, and the BYO Nano podcast comes out on the 15th of every month. And don't forget to go check out probrewer.com each week for original articles from the All About Beer team. As for this show, Nate Schweber does the music. Jeff Quinn designed our logo. And I'm John Holl. New episodes release every Wednesday, and that's when I'll be back again to drink beer and to think beer.